morning at the military base had started like any other, with strict routines, sharp orders, and disciplined movement across every corner of the facility. Soldiers were already training in the open fields, and officers were moving between meetings with focused expressions. Nothing suggested that within a few hours, the entire atmosphere would turn heavy with tension and urgency. Inside the main command building, the general was going through routine reports when a sudden phone call broke the silence. The tone on the other end was not ordinary. It was sharp, urgent, and full of concern. Within seconds, the general's expression changed. He stood up slowly, asking for the message to be repeated as if he could not believe what he had just heard. A critical medical emergency had occurred involving an important official visiting the base. The situation was serious enough that immediate intervention was required. The patient had collapsed suddenly, and the medical team on site was already struggling to stabilize him. Every passing minute mattered, and the risk of losing him was increasing. The general did not waste another second. He ordered immediate activation of the base's top medical unit. Within moments, announcements echoed through the corridors, calling senior doctors to the emergency wing. The calm atmosphere of the base quickly shifted into controlled chaos. Doors opened and closed rapidly, footsteps increased, and communication devices buzzed non-stop. In the emergency wing, the medical staff gathered around the patient. The room was bright, sterile, and filled with monitors showing unstable readings. The patient was unconscious, and his condition was not improving despite initial treatment efforts. Doctors were speaking in low, urgent voices trying to figure out the next step. Every attempt seemed to give only temporary or no improvement. One of the senior doctors wiped his forehead and quietly admitted that the situation was more complicated than expected. The symptoms did not follow a simple pattern, and standard procedures were not working as they should. Another doctor adjusted the equipment again, hoping for a different result, but the monitor continued to show concerning signs. Outside the emergency room, tension was building. The general had arrived and was standing just beyond the glass doors, watching everything closely. His presence alone made the environment more intense. He did not speak much, but his silence carried pressure. Every staff member knew the importance of the patient inside the room, and failure was not an option anyone wanted to consider. Time seemed to move faster than usual. Every minute felt like seconds slipping away. The doctors continued their efforts, trying different combinations of treatment, but the patient's condition remained unstable. There were moments when the readings improved slightly, but then they dropped again without warning. It was unpredictable and worrying. A nurse moved quickly between stations, handing over reports and adjusting equipment. Her face showed focus but also concern. She had seen emergencies before, but something about this case felt different. It was not just the severity, but the resistance of the condition to every standard approach being used. The general finally stepped closer to the medical team outside the room and asked for an update. His voice was calm, but firm. One of the senior doctors turned toward him and explained the situation honestly. They had done everything they could within their current capacity, but the condition was not responding as expected. More specialized expertise might be required. The words specialized expertise hung in the air. No one wanted to say it directly, but everyone understood the meaning. It suggested that the current team might not be enough. The general's expression hardened slightly, but he did not show anger. Instead, he focused on solutions. He asked if there was anyone available who could handle such a complex case. There was a brief silence. The doctors exchanged glances, unsure how to answer immediately. They respected their own skills, but they also knew the limits of what they were facing. After a moment, one of them mentioned a name carefully, almost hesitantly. It was not a name spoken often in regular conversations. It belonged to someone known in medical circles for handling extremely difficult cases, someone who had stepped into situations others had given up on. The general listened without interrupting. The suggestion was not simple. Calling that person meant trusting someone outside the usual chain of command in a situation that already carried heavy responsibility. But at the same time, doing nothing was not an option either. The condition of the patient was still unstable, and the clock was not slowing down for anyone. Inside the emergency room, The monitors beeped steadily, creating a constant reminder of the fragile condition of the patient. The medical team continued working, but there was a growing awareness that they were reaching the limits of what they could do alone. Each doctor focused on their task, yet the atmosphere carried a silent understanding that help might need to come from somewhere else. The general stood still for a moment, looking through the glass again. His mind was processing every detail quickly. He had seen many crises before, both military and medical, but this situation felt different. It was not about strategy or strength. It was about precision, knowledge, and timing. And right now, time was the most dangerous factor of all. He finally made a decision. Without raising his voice, he instructed his aide to prepare immediate contact with the recommended specialist. The order was clear and direct. There was no hesitation anymore. The situation required action, not discussion. As the message was being prepared, the emergency room continued its struggle. The doctors remained focused, but fatigue was beginning to show. The pressure of responsibility weighed heavily on everyone present. The patient's condition had not improved, and every passing second increased the urgency. Outside, the general remained in place, watching silently. He did not know how long it would take for help to arrive, or whether it would arrive in time at all. But for the first time since the emergency began, there was a small shift in direction. A decision had been made. Call had been sent. And somewhere beyond the base, someone with a reputation for handling the impossible was being contacted. What no one in the room yet knew was how this decision would change everything in ways they were not prepared for. The message had been sent, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Even though action had been taken, there was still no guarantee of how fast help would arrive, or if it would arrive in time. Inside the military base, everything continued moving, but now every movement felt sharper, more tense, more meaningful. The emergency wing remained the center of attention. The patient's condition had not improved, and the medical team was still working with full focus. Machines continued to beep in a steady rhythm, but those sounds now felt like reminders of how fragile the situation was. Every reading on the monitors carried importance, and every slight change made the doctors react immediately. The general stood outside the glass wall, watching without interruption. His expression remained controlled, but inside he was calculating every possibility. He had dealt with emergencies before, but this one was different. It was not a battlefield situation where orders alone could fix things. This was something slower, more delicate, and far less predictable. Inside the room, one of the senior doctors leaned closer to the monitor and frowned. The patient's condition had slightly worsened again. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual decline that was difficult to stop. They had already tried multiple approaches, but nothing was giving stable results. Every method seemed to help for a short moment before losing effect. A nurse quietly adjusted the four-line and checked the readings again. Her movements were careful, almost automatic, but her eyes revealed concern. She had been working for years in high-pressure environments, yet something about this case felt unusually resistant. It was as if the condition was not responding the way medical training usually predicted. Another doctor stepped away from the table for a moment and spoke in a low voice to a colleague. They exchanged quick thoughts about possible causes, but none of the explanations fully matched the symptoms. There were too many irregular patterns, too many unexpected reactions. It was becoming clear that they were not dealing with a standard case. Outside, the general finally turned slightly toward his aide and asked for an update on the specialist. The message had been sent, but there was still no confirmation of arrival. The aide explained that the contact had been made successfully, and the specialist had been informed. However, travel time and availability were still uncertain. It was a waiting game now. The general did not respond immediately. He simply nodded once and looked back at the emergency room. Waiting was the most difficult part of any crisis. Decisions had been made, but results had not yet appeared. That gap between action and outcome always felt longer than it really was. Inside the emergency room, tension was slowly building. The doctors were continuing treatment, but the atmosphere had changed slightly. There was a quiet awareness that they might soon have to hand over control if the specialist arrived. Some of them felt relief at the idea, while others felt frustration. No one wanted to admit defeat, but they also understood the seriousness of the situation. One of the senior doctors finally spoke openly to the team. He said they should continue stabilizing efforts as best as possible until further instructions arrived. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying seriousness. He reminded everyone that even if help was coming, their role was still critical. Every minute of stability mattered. The team refocused. Monitors were checked again, medications were adjusted slightly, and the patient's vitals were carefully watched. Despite their fatigue, the medical staff continued working with full attention. The room remained quiet except for the steady sounds of equipment and occasional short instructions. At the same time, the general walked a few steps away from the glass wall and spoke quietly with a senior officer. The conversation was brief but important. They discussed the identity of the specialist and the reason for their reputation. The officer explained that this person had handled cases that others considered impossible, often stepping in when time was running out and options were limited. The general listened carefully. He did not interrupt, but his eyes showed that he was processing every detail. Trusting someone outside the military system was not a small decision. Everything in his experience had taught him to rely on established structures, clear ranks, and proven protocols. But this situation was not allowing time for hesitation. Back inside the emergency room, the patient's condition showed another slight fluctuation. For a moment, the readings improved, and a few doctors reacted with cautious hope. But just as quickly, the numbers stabilized at a weak level again. It was unpredictable, and that unpredictability was exhausting everyone involved. A young medical assistant quietly asked one of the doctors if there was anything else they could try. The doctor paused before answering. He did not want to discourage the assistant, but he also did not want to give false hope. He simply said they were doing everything currently possible and that they needed to wait for more advanced input. The assistant nodded and returned to her station, visibly affected. The emotional weight in the room was growing, even though everyone was trying to stay professional. In environments like this, emotions were often controlled, but they were never completely absent. The general received another update from his aide after a short while. The specialist had acknowledged the request and was reviewing the details. There was still no exact time of arrival, but the response itself was a sign that the situation was being taken seriously. That alone brought a small but noticeable shift in the general's mindset. He returned to the glass wall and observed the ongoing treatment again. The patient was still unconscious, and the medical team was still trying everything within their reach. The general noticed the steady coordination among the staff. Despite pressure and uncertainty, they were not giving up. That level of discipline was something he respected deeply. Inside the room, one of the monitors suddenly gave a slightly unstable reading, causing immediate attention from the team. Doctors moved closer, checking the cause carefully. After a few tense seconds, they adjusted the treatment and stabilized the readings again. It was a small incident, but it reminded everyone how quickly things could change. The senior doctor stepped back slightly and exhaled slowly. He admitted, mostly to himself, that this situation was beyond their usual limits. They could maintain stability for short periods, but long-term recovery seemed uncertain without advanced intervention. He did not say this loudly, but his expression showed it clearly. Outside, the general noticed the subtle changes in the team's behavior. He had learned over the years how to read people under pressure. The small signs, the pauses, the glances, the silence between instructions, were all indicators of concern. He knew the situation was still critical, even if no one said it directly. Time continued to pass. The base outside remained active, but the emergency wing felt like a separate world where everything else had slowed down. Every second carried importance and every update mattered. The specialist's arrival had now become the central point of hope, but also uncertainty. The general received confirmation that transport arrangements had been activated. The specialist was on the way, though exact timing remained unclear. That information created a slight shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer just waiting for a decision. It was now waiting for a person to arrive. Inside the room, the doctors continued their work with steady focus. The patient remained unstable but alive. Every effort was directed toward keeping that condition steady until help arrived. There was no celebration, no relief, only continuation. Outside, the general stood quietly once more. He looked at the emergency wing with a focused expression, knowing that everything now depended on time and expertise. A decision had been made. A call had been answered. But the most important moment was still ahead, and no one yet knew exactly how it would unfold. The message had gone through, and after that, everything entered a strange kind of waiting silence again. The emergency wing continued its work, but now there was a different feeling in the air. It was not just pressure anymore, it was expectation. Everyone knew someone was coming, but no one knew exactly when, or what kind of presence would walk through those doors. Inside the medical unit, the patient's condition remained fragile. The monitors kept showing unstable readings, and the medical team continued their careful adjustments. No one had stopped working, but their rhythm had changed slightly. Every action now felt like it was being done while waiting for something important to interrupt at any moment. Outside the emergency wing, the general had not moved far from his position. He stayed close enough to observe everything but far enough to avoid interfering. His expression was controlled, but his focus was sharp. He had already seen enough to understand that his team was reaching their limits. Now, everything depended on whether the specialist could truly make a difference. Then, finally, a notification came through on the communication line. The specialist had arrived at the base. There was no dramatic announcement, no loud arrival signal, and no unnecessary attention. The arrival was confirmed quietly, as if the person on the other end of the line treated this kind of emergency as something routine. That alone created a strange feeling among the officers receiving the message. Within moments, a security escort was sent to guide the visitor from the entrance to the medical wing. The corridors of the base, usually filled with structured movement and disciplined noise, now felt slightly different. Word spread quickly among staff that the specialist had arrived, and people began to pause what they were doing just to catch a glimpse. The general adjusted his posture slightly when he heard the confirmation. He did not react dramatically, but there was a shift in his attention. He stepped closer to the corridor leading into the emergency wing, waiting for the first appearance. A few minutes later, footsteps could be heard in the distance. They were steady and unhurried. That detail stood out immediately to those listening. In a place where every second usually brought urgency and fast movement, these footsteps carried a calm rhythm that did not match the environment. Then the specialist appeared. There was nothing flashy about the entrance. A simple figure carrying a small medical case, walking alongside two escorts who seemed more alert than the person they were guiding. The specialist's appearance did not match the expectations many had formed. There was no visible tension, no rushing, no scanning of the environment with panic. Instead, there was calm attention, as if the surroundings were already understood. Some of the staff members watching from a distance exchanged quick glances. A few of them looked uncertain. It was not what they had imagined when they heard about a top specialist. The quiet confidence was there, but it was not loud or dramatic. It was controlled, almost understated. The general watched carefully as the specialist approached. For a moment he studied the expression, the posture, and the movement. Years of experience had taught him to read people quickly, especially in high-pressure situations. What he saw was not hesitation, but also not arrogance. It was something else, calm focus. When the specialist reached the entrance of the emergency wing, security stepped aside. The doors opened, and for a brief moment, the noise of the corridor and the controlled chaos of the medical room mixed together. Inside, the medical team noticed the change immediately. One of the doctors looked up first, followed by the rest. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. Everyone recognized that someone new had entered, and even before introductions were made, attention moved toward the entrance. The specialist stepped inside slowly, taking in the room without rushing. The monitors, the patient, the staff movements, everything was observed in a few seconds. There was no shock, no confusion, and no visible surprise. Just quiet assessment. The senior doctor approached and gave a brief explanation of the case. He spoke quickly, covering key details, the symptoms, and the treatments already attempted. His voice carried a slight urgency, as if he wanted to make sure nothing was missed. The specialist listened without interrupting. Not once. That silence felt unusual to the team. In most high-pressure medical situations, discussions were immediate, questions were rapid, and opinions were exchanged quickly. But here, there was only listening. When the explanation finished, there was a short pause. The specialist walked closer to the patient. The movement was slow and deliberate. No unnecessary rush, no dramatic gestures. Just careful steps toward the bed. The room seemed to quiet even more as the attention of every person followed that movement. The specialist looked at the monitors first, then at the patient, then at the medical records displayed on the screen. Every detail was observed carefully, but still without urgency. One of the junior doctors quietly whispered something to another, questioning whether this calm approach was normal for such a critical situation. The answer was not given, but the uncertainty remained in the air. The general, still observing from outside the glass, narrowed his eyes slightly. He had expected confidence, but this level of calmness in such a situation was unusual even for experienced professionals. There was no visible reaction to the severity of the case. It was as if the complexity had already been mentally accepted. Inside the room, one of the doctors finally asked a question carefully. He wanted to know what the next step would be, given the urgency. The specialist did not answer immediately. Instead, the medical case was placed on a nearby table. The gloves were adjusted slowly. The silence continued for a few more seconds, stretching the tension even further. Then, finally, the specialist spoke. The voice was calm, steady, and direct. No unnecessary words. No emotional tone. Just clarity. The first statement was not about treatment. It was about confirmation. More checks were needed. A deeper review of the condition was required before any intervention could begin. That response surprised a few of the staff. They had expected immediate action, but instead, the focus was on verification. One of the senior doctors tried to explain again that time was critical, but the specialist raised a hand slightly, not in dismissal but in control. The message was clear without being harsh. Rushing without full understanding could make things worse. That moment created a silent shift in the room. Some of the staff exchanged uncertain looks, while others slowly accepted the direction. There was something about the confidence in the specialist's tone that made arguing feel unnecessary. The general outside noticed this change too. He had seen enough command situations to recognize when authority in a room shifted. It was not loud or forced. It simply happened when someone took control in a way others naturally followed. The specialist moved closer to the patient again and began reviewing the condition more deeply. Small instruments were taken from the case. Measurements were checked again. The monitor data was reevaluated with careful attention. Every action was slow but precise. The room remained silent except for the soft sounds of equipment. At one point, the specialist paused and focused on a specific reading on the monitor. The expression did not change, but the attention sharpened slightly. That subtle shift did not go unnoticed by the doctors watching nearby. Something had been found, or at least something had caught attention. But nothing was said immediately. Instead, the specialist continued observing, as if building a complete picture before making any move. The tension in the room grew quietly. The medical team waited for instructions. The general waited outside for answers. And the patient remained in a fragile state, unchanged for now, while a decision was being formed that could determine everything that came next. The specialist finally stepped back slightly from the bed, still calm, still focused, and looked at the team for the first time since entering. What would be said next would decide whether hope increased, or whether the situation became even more uncertain. The room remained silent after the specialist stepped back from the patient. It was not an empty silence, but a heavy one filled with expectation. Every person in the emergency wing was waiting for the next words, the next instruction, or the next decision. Even the sound of the monitors felt louder than before, as if the machines themselves were aware that something important was about to happen. The specialist stood still for a moment, eyes fixed on the data being displayed. The expression remained calm, but the focus had deepened. It was clear that the earlier observation phase had ended. Now, something had been understood. Something serious enough to change the direction of the entire situation. The senior doctor took a small step forward, trying to read the specialist's reaction. He did not want to interrupt, but the tension in the room made waiting difficult. The patient's condition was still unstable, and every second felt like it carried weight. Finally, the specialist spoke again. The voice was steady, but firmer than before. The condition was more complicated than initially reported. That single statement changed the mood in the room immediately. The doctors exchanged quick glances. They already knew the case was difficult, but hearing it confirmed by someone with this level of reputation made it feel more serious. The specialist continued. There was a deeper issue affecting the patient's stability, something that standard emergency treatment could not fully address. The earlier attempts had helped temporarily, but they had not reached the root cause. That was why the condition kept fluctuating. The senior doctor listened carefully, his expression tightening slightly. He admitted quietly that they had suspected something similar, but had not been able to confirm it fully. The specialist nodded once, acknowledging the effort already made, but did not stop there. A new plan would be required. Not a continuation of what had been done, but a shift in approach. The words were simple, but their meaning carried weight. Changing approach in a critical condition meant risk. It meant stepping away from what was already being done and trusting a different direction entirely. One of the junior doctors spoke carefully, asking whether there was enough time for such a change. His voice carried concern, not doubt, but genuine worry about the patient's stability. The specialist did not react emotionally to the question. Instead, there was a brief pause before answering. Time was already limited, but continuing the current path without correction would lead to further decline. The honesty of that response made the room even quieter. No one argued because the logic was clear. It was not about preference anymore. It was about necessity. Outside the glass wall, the general noticed the shift in body language inside the room. The staff were no longer just working, they were listening. That difference was important. It meant control had shifted not through authority, but through trust. The general stepped slightly closer, focusing on the interaction inside. He could not hear every word clearly, but he could read the rhythm of the room. The specialist was now in charge of direction, and the medical team was following carefully. Inside, the specialist moved closer to the patient again and began explaining the first step of the new approach. The explanation was simple but precise. There was no unnecessary detail, just what needed to be done and why. The treatment would need adjustment, but not immediately in a drastic way. First, the body's response needed to be carefully stabilized in a more controlled pattern. Then, based on reaction, further steps would follow. The senior doctor nodded slowly, processing the instructions. He understood the logic, but the execution would require careful coordination. He turned to his team and began assigning tasks quickly. The room came alive again, but in a more structured way. This time there was direction. Each staff member knew what they were supposed to do, and movements became more synchronized. However, not everything was simple. As the adjustments began, the patient's readings reacted unpredictably. For a brief moment, the monitor showed improvement. The numbers stabilized slightly, and there was a small shift that gave everyone a hint of hope. One of the nurses noticed it first, her eyes widening slightly. But just as quickly, the readings shifted again. This time, the change was sharper. The improvement did not hold. A few doctors exchanged concerned looks. It was not unexpected for a critical condition, but it still created tension. The specialist remained calm, watching the response carefully. Instead of reacting immediately, the specialist studied the pattern. Every fluctuation carried meaning. It was not random. It was a response to internal imbalance, and that meant adjustments had to be more precise. The specialist raised a hand slightly, signaling the team to pause for a moment. The room stopped again. Even the smallest movement paused. The specialist adjusted the approach slightly, modifying one of the earlier instructions. It was a subtle change, but important. The kind of adjustment that could only be made after careful observation of response patterns. The team followed immediately. Outside, the general saw the second shift in control. It was no longer just planning, it was real-time adaptation. That level of precision was what separated experience from expertise. He folded his arms slightly, watching without blinking. For the first time since the emergency began, there was something different in the room. Not stability yet, but direction that felt controlled. Inside, the adjustments continued. This time, the reaction was more stable. The monitor readings did not improve dramatically, but they stopped fluctuating sharply. That alone was significant. It meant the system was responding better to the new approach. A few staff members quietly exchanged relieved expressions, but no one spoke. They knew better than to assume success too early. The specialist kept focus steady, observing every small change. Then came another critical moment. The patient's condition suddenly dipped again, but not as sharply as before. It was a weaker decline, almost controlled. That detail mattered. It suggested the system was still fragile, but now responding under influence rather than collapsing freely. The specialist adjusted again. This time, the change was more confident. A second modification was made, slightly reinforcing the earlier adjustment. The team followed without hesitation. There was no confusion anymore. Trust had already formed through results, not words. Slowly, the monitor began to show more consistent readings. Not fully stable yet, but no longer chaotic. The senior doctor exhaled quietly, realizing the difference. The situation had not been solved, but it was no longer slipping out of control either. That transition alone was important in critical care. Outside, the general noticed it too. The atmosphere inside the room had changed. The urgency was still there, but it was no longer panic-driven. It was controlled urgency now, guided by structured decision-making. He turned slightly toward his aide, who stood nearby, and asked for a status update. The aide confirmed that the specialist had taken full lead inside the emergency room and was actively managing the case. The general nodded once. He did not speak further, but his attention remained fixed on the room. Inside, the specialist continued monitoring closely. Every few moments, small adjustments were made. Nothing rushed, nothing careless. Each change was based on observation. The team worked in sync now, responding quickly to instructions. The earlier uncertainty had reduced, replaced by focused discipline. A nurse quietly checked the patient's vital signs and reported a slight improvement trend. It was not dramatic, but it was consistent enough to be noticed. The specialist acknowledged it with a small nod but did not show celebration. It was too early for that. The condition was still fragile. But something important had changed. The system was now responding in a controlled way. The senior doctor glanced at the specialist, realizing that the approach was working, but still carefully balanced on a thin line. One wrong assumption, one wrong adjustment, could reverse everything. The specialist seemed aware of that too. There was no relaxation, no easing of focus, only steady attention. Outside, the general continued watching, realizing something quietly. This was no longer a situation where time alone would decide the outcome. It was now a situation where precision mattered more than speed. And as the emergency room moved into this delicate phase of controlled stabilization, everyone understood that the most critical part of the process was still ahead. The emergency room had entered a different kind of silence now. It was no longer the tense silence of uncertainty or fear, but a focused silence where every movement had meaning. The monitors still beeped steadily, but the rhythm was more stable than before. The patient's condition was no longer falling apart, but it was not fully safe either. It was a fragile balance that could change at any moment. Inside the room, the specialist stood close to the patient, watching every reading carefully. The earlier adjustments had created a controlled response, but the work was not finished. The situation required patience now, not urgency. Every small decision had to be measured. The medical team worked quietly around the room. Their movements were more coordinated than before, almost like they had adjusted to a shared rhythm. There was no confusion anymore, only careful execution of instructions. Even the junior staff members understood that this phase required precision above everything else. The senior doctor glanced at the monitor again and noticed something that brought a slight change in his expression. The readings were not only stable, they were slowly improving. It was gradual, not sudden, but it was consistent. That consistency mattered more than anything else at this stage. He looked toward the specialist, who was still observing without any visible emotion. There was no sign of satisfaction yet, no relaxation. It was as if the improvement was expected, not surprising. That calm attitude kept the team focused. No one dared to assume success too early. Outside the glass wall, the general stood silently, watching everything unfold. He had been there since the beginning of the crisis, and now he could clearly see the difference in the atmosphere. The panic was gone. The urgency was still present, but it was controlled. The room no longer felt like it was on the edge of collapse. An aide approached quietly and gave a brief update. The patient's condition had shown measurable improvement under the specialist's direction. The general listened without interrupting, his eyes still fixed on the room. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the information. Inside, the specialist made another small adjustment. It was not a major change, but a refinement. The kind of correction that only came after observing how the system responded to earlier actions. The medical team followed immediately, confident now in the direction being taken. A nurse checked the readings again and this time allowed herself a quiet breath of relief. The numbers were holding steady. Not perfect, but stable enough to reduce immediate risk. She looked toward one of the doctors, and for a moment, there was a shared understanding in their eyes. The situation had changed, but the specialist did not stop. The focus remained intense. Even when stability improved, there was still risk beneath the surface. The condition had not been fully resolved. It had only been brought under control. That difference was important, and the specialist treated it seriously. The senior doctor spoke softly, asking what the next step would be. His tone was respectful, but also cautious. He understood that stability did not mean completion. The specialist replied calmly that the system needed time to respond fully to the adjustments already made. Any unnecessary interference now could disrupt the balance. The focus was to maintain stability and observe how the patient's body reacted naturally. The team accepted the instruction immediately. The room settled into a careful waiting phase again, but this time it was different. It was not anxious waiting. It was controlled observation. Every person in the room was alert, but no one was panicking anymore. Outside, the general noticed this shift clearly. He had seen enough operations in his career to understand when a situation moved from crisis to recovery phase. This was not final recovery yet, but it was no longer critical instability. That transition alone was significant. He stepped slightly closer to the glass, studying the patient's condition and the team's behavior. Everything appeared more stable now. The movements were steady, the communication was calm, and the urgency had softened into focus. Inside the room, time continued to pass. Minutes stretched quietly, each one watched closely. Then came a moment that caught everyone's attention. The patient's readings improved again, slightly stronger this time. It was not a spike or sudden recovery, but a steady upward trend. One of the nurses noticed it and quickly confirmed it. The numbers were consistent across multiple readings. The senior doctor looked at the monitor and then at the specialist, waiting for confirmation of what this meant. The specialist observed for a few seconds before giving a small nod. It was a positive response, but still caution remained. The specialist explained that while the improvement was real, the system was still adjusting internally. Sudden changes at this stage could reverse progress. Everything needed to remain steady and undisturbed. The team continued monitoring closely. Inside the room, the atmosphere had changed completely from the beginning of the emergency. Earlier, every second felt like a race against collapse. Now, every second felt like part of a recovery process that required patience. Outside, the general received another update. The patient was now in a stabilized condition with signs of gradual improvement. The report was clear and direct. The urgency had reduced significantly, but monitoring would continue. The general remained silent for a moment after hearing this. His expression softened slightly, but only for a brief moment. He had learned not to relax too early in situations like this. Still, the improvement was undeniable. Inside the room, the specialist stepped slightly back from the patient and observed the entire setup again. The machines, the readings, the team's responses, all were stable now. This was the point where intervention had done its part, and observation became more important. The specialist finally gave instructions for reduced intervention. The medical team was to maintain current support levels and avoid unnecessary changes unless required. The body needed time to stabilize on its own under the new conditions. The senior doctor repeated the instructions to ensure clarity, then confirmed compliance. The room entered a quieter phase again. But this silence was different from before. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of controlled stability. Outside, the general was finally called inside the emergency room. For the first time since the specialist had taken control, he stepped into the room. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere slightly, as it always did. But this time, there was no panic around him. The team was steady, focused, and calm. He walked slowly toward the patient, observing the monitors first. The readings were stable, showing improvement trends. Then he looked at the medical team, who appeared more composed than earlier. Finally, his eyes turned toward the specialist. There was a brief pause. The general had seen many reports, many situations, and many medical outcomes during his career. But seeing the actual condition in front of him carried more weight than any written update. He asked for a direct status report. The senior doctor began to respond, but the specialist stepped forward slightly and gave the explanation instead. The tone was calm and simple. The condition had been stabilized through controlled intervention, and the patient was now responding positively. The general listened carefully, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was completely still. Then the general walked closer to the patient. He looked at the monitors again, then at the team, and finally at the specialist. There was silence for a few seconds. No one spoke. Then the general said something quietly that changed the feeling in the room. He acknowledged that the situation had shifted from critical danger to controlled recovery. That recognition carried weight. The medical team felt a quiet sense of relief, but they did not react outwardly. The specialist simply nodded once, as if acknowledging what had already been expected. The general turned slightly and looked at the team again. His expression showed something rare: respect. Not loud, not emotional, but clear. He then looked back at the specialist. There was a long pause, and then, in a calm voice, he said that he had underestimated the situation earlier. That simple statement carried more meaning than anything else in the room. The specialist did not respond with pride or emotion. Only a small nod, as if it was not about personal recognition at all. It was about the patient. Outside the room, the base continued its normal operations, unaware of the intense hours that had just passed inside the emergency wing. But inside, everyone understood something important had happened. A life had moved from the edge of collapse to a path of recovery. And the most unexpected part was not just the outcome, but how quietly and precisely it had been achieved. The general stood there for a moment longer, watching the steady monitors. The crisis was not just resolved. It had been transformed. And in that quiet realization, everyone in the room understood that what they had just witnessed was not only treatment. It was expertise under pressure that had changed everything.